Hey guys. Have you ever woken up at 3 a.m., stared at the ceiling, and thought, well, this is it. My brain is broken. You just lie there, wide awake, as your mind cycles through every embarrassing thing you've ever done since kindergarten, the lyrics to a song you hate, and a sudden, urgent need to know how magnets work. What if I told you that for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, that 3 a.m. anxiety fest wasn't a sign of a broken brain? What if I told you, it was the goal? Tonight, we are diving headfirst into one of the weirdest, most forgotten aspects of human history, the fact that for most of our existence, nobody slept through the night. On purpose. But that bizarre little keyhole is just the beginning. We're going to use it to peek into a world where your bed was a party, your food was a plate, your doctor was basically a weatherman for your bodily fluids, and time itself was, well, let's just say it was a bit squishy. So, if that sounds like you're kind of weird, consider joining our little history club by hitting subscribe, but honestly, only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. There's no pressure in our corner of the internet. While you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is. It is genuinely one of my favorite things to see this community scattered across every single time zone, united in our love for the glorious absurdity of the past. Alright. Now, do me a favor. Dim the lights. If you have a drink, now's the time to grab it. Maybe it's a late-night coffee, an early morning tea, or something a little stronger, no judgment here. Get comfortable, and let's pull back the dusty, moth-eaten curtain on the medieval night. Our story begins with a historian named Roger Ekirch in the 1990s. He was doing what historians do, spending years of his life buried in dusty, forgotten documents, probably fueled by lukewarm coffee and the quiet thrill of discovery. He wasn't looking for sleep patterns. He was researching the history of the night. But he kept stumbling across these weird phrases. He found references in court depositions, in diaries, in letters, in medical texts, in plays, and even in prayer manuals, all talking about something called first sleep. And if there's a first sleep, well, you don't have to be a detective to figure out there must be a second. He'd stumbled upon a ghost in our collective memory, biphasic sleep. For centuries, from at least the time of Homer all the way up until the Industrial Revolution, people in the Western world went to bed, slept for about 4 hours, woke up for an hour or two, and then went back to sleep for another 4 hours. This wasn't a strange habit of a few eccentrics. This was just how sleep worked. It was as normal as the sun rising. Think of it like binge-watching a show on Netflix. You watch the first 4 episodes, that's your first sleep. Then you get up, you raid the fridge for that questionable tub of leftover chili, you text a friend, you up, and you ponder the massive plot twist you just saw. That's the waking watch. Then you go back to the couch and finish the season. That's your second sleep. The question is, why? The answer is brutally simple, darkness. Before the gas lamp, before the electric light bulb, the night was dark. Not, I should turn on a lamp dark. I mean profoundly, deeply, almost tangibly dark. The kind of darkness that swallows sound. For a huge chunk of the year, you could be looking at 12, 14, even 16 hours of it. And what do you do with all that time? You can't exactly scroll through TikTok. You can't read easily, because candles and oil lamps were expensive, smoky, and a massive fire hazard. You couldn't just leave a candle burning all night unless you wanted to wake up to the C major symphony of your own roof collapsing in flames. So, what did you do? You went to bed. Early. People's lives were dictated not by the clock on the wall, but by the giant clock in the sky. When the sun went down, the world shut down. So you'd have an early dinner, maybe tell some stories around the fire, and then, as the last embers died down, you'd head off to bed. Maybe as early as 8 or 9 p.m. You'd sleep until about midnight or 1 a.m. And then, you'd just wake up. Naturally. And for an hour or two, the world would be alive in the quiet, inky blackness. So what on earth were people doing during this midnight intermission? This waking watch, as they called it, wasn't a groggy, confused stumble to the bathroom. It was a recognized and legitimate part of the day. It was a time for, well, pretty much anything. For the religious, and let's be honest, almost everyone was religious, this was prime time for prayer and contemplation. The night was seen as a time when the veil between the physical and spiritual world was thin. It was quiet. It was personal. You could have a good, long chat with the man upstairs without your neighbor interrupting to ask if he could borrow your ox. There were even specific prayers and psalms designated for this holy hour. It was a scheduled appointment with the divine. For the more practical-minded, the hustle never stopped. This was a time to get stuff done. You could stoke the dying fire, check on the livestock to make sure a fox wasn't planning a midnight snack, or do some mending by the low light of the hearth. For the women of the house, it could be a time to brew the next day's ale, knead some dough, or do any number of chores that required a bit of quiet concentration. For the scholars, the thinkers, the writers, this was gold. The house was quiet. The world was asleep. It was a period of intense creativity. They believed the mind was clearer, more rested after that first sleep. It said that this was the time when people would reflect on their dreams, which they took very, very seriously as omens or messages. They'd think, they'd write, they'd ponder the universe. And then, of course, there was the most popular activity of all. Procreation. No, seriously. Medical texts from the 16th century explicitly advised couples that the best time to conceive a child was not at the end of a long, exhausting day of backbreaking labor, but after the first sleep. You were more rested, more relaxed. They even thought it led to more children. It was less about romance and more about efficient, well-rested productivity. The waking watch was also a time for socializing. You could have a quiet chat with your spouse or the other people you were sharing a room with. And oh, we will get to who you were sharing a room with. It was a time for intimacy that wasn't just physical. It was a moment of quiet connection in a life that was often very loud and very public. And for the less savory members of society, it was a fantastic time for crime. The night was their kingdom. While honest folk were praying or chatting, others were out poaching, thieving, or generally causing trouble under the concealing cloak of true darkness. So this hour wasn't wasted time. It was a unique, liminal space, a secret chapter of the day between the two great volumes of sleep. It was a time for God, for chores, for thinking, for sex, and for crime. A pretty full schedule for 1 a.m. Now, I mentioned sharing a room. Let's talk about the medieval bedroom, because if you think your studio apartment is cramped, you have no idea. Our modern concept of a bedroom is a deeply personal, private sanctuary. It's your space. You close the door, and the world goes away. The medieval bedroom, for 99% of the population, was not that. It was a communal charging station. For the vast majority of people, a family lived in a 1- or 2-room house. And that's where everything happened. You cooked, you ate, you worked, you socialized, and you slept. All in the same space. The idea of a separate room just for sleeping was a luxury beyond comprehension. And you didn't just share a room with your immediate family. You might have servants sleeping on the floor at the foot of your bed. If a guest came to stay, they wouldn't get the guest room, they'd get a spot in your bed. Yes, in your bed. Beds were one of the most expensive pieces of furniture a family could own. A good bed with a feather mattress and linens could be worth more than a small house. In a person's will, the second best bed was often a significant inheritance. Shakespeare famously left his wife his second best bed. For centuries, people have debated if this was an insult, but it might have just been a practical matter. The best bed was for guests, the second best was their actual marriage bed. So you'd have the parents, a couple of kids, maybe a visiting cousin, and a trusted servant or two all piled into one giant bed. It wasn't sexual, it was practical. It was about warmth. Central heating wasn't exactly a thing. The only heat came from the fireplace, and once that died down, a room got cold fast. The best way to stay warm was with a pile of other human beings. It was basically a giant, snoring, occasionally farting human radiator. For the poor, a bed might just be a straw-stuffed sack on the floor, with everyone huddling together under a shared blanket. For the wealthy, you get the iconic four-poster bed. We think of it now as this grand, romantic piece of furniture. But its purpose was pure function. The curtains weren't for decoration. You would draw them at night to create a tiny, self-contained room within a room. It trapped your body heat and kept out the drafts from the ridiculously drafty castles and manor houses. It also offered the only shred of privacy you were likely to get all day. Behind those curtains, you could have your quiet conversations during the waking watch, or your doctor-recommended procreation session, without the whole household watching. But even for the rich, the bedroom was a semi-public space. A lord or lady would often receive guests and conduct business from their bed, especially in the morning. The bed was a seat of power, not just a place of rest. So imagine this scene. It's midnight. You wake up from your first sleep. You're in a big bed, with your spouse on one side, your two kids at the foot, and your cousin snoring gently next to you. In the corner of the room, you can hear the soft breathing of your farmhand. You might nudge your spouse and have a quiet conversation about the price of wheat, or you might listen to your cousin's muffled sleep-talking for a while. It was a fundamentally different way of experiencing the world, where the lines between public and private, and even between individuals, were incredibly blurry. Your personal space was whatever you could carve out with a curtain or a blanket. So you've survived the night. You've had your two sleeps, you've prayed, you've chatted, you've maybe done a chore or two. The first faint, gray light of dawn starts to creep in. The rooster, that feathered alarm clock of the pre-industrial world, starts its daily shouting match with the sunrise. What happens next? Let's talk about the medieval morning routine. The first thing you absolutely do not do is hit the snooze button. Because it doesn't exist. The second thing you don't do is stumble to the kitchen to make a big pot of coffee. Coffee wouldn't become a popular drink in Europe until the 17th century. For most of the medieval period, your morning pick-me-up was, well, nothing. Or maybe, small beer, which we'll get to. No, the very first thing you did, before your feet even hit the cold floor, was pray. You'd say your morning prayers, thanking God for getting you through the night. The night was a dangerous time, full of literal and metaphorical demons. Waking up was not a given, it was a blessing. So you started with gratitude and a quick spiritual check-in. Then, you'd get dressed. This wasn't a quick matter of throwing on a t-shirt and jeans. It was a process of layering. For a basic peasant man, you're looking at linen undergarments, woolen hose, basically leggings, that you had to tie on, a tunic, and a belt. Everything was functional. The belt wasn't just for holding up your tunic, it was a tool belt where you'd hang your purse, your knife, your keys. For a woman, it was a similar process of layers, a chemise, a long dress or kirtle, maybe an overdress, and a head covering. Being a married woman without your hair covered in public was basically the medieval equivalent of walking around with your fly down. It just wasn't done. Then it's time for a bit of morning hygiene. And this is where our modern sensibilities start to scream. You'd likely have a bowl of water and a cloth. You'd wash your hands and face. And that might be it. Full-body bathing was not a daily, or even weekly, activity. It was a special occasion. For the wealthy, you might have a servant bring you a basin of heated, scented water. For the poor, it was a bucket of cold water from the well. And the toilet? If you were lucky, you had a privy, which was a nice word for a shed with a hole in it out back. If you were less lucky, you used a chamber pot, which was a bowl you kept under the bed. And whose job was it to empty that bowl in the morning? Usually the woman of the house or a servant. They just chucked the contents into the street. Yes, the street. This is why you hear stories of people shouting a warning from their window before they emptied the pot. The medieval city was an assault on the senses, and the morning was prime time for dodging, well, everything. So you're prayed up, dressed, and you've splashed some water on your face. Time for a hearty breakfast, right? Bacon, eggs, toast. Wrong. For most of the medieval period, the concept of breakfast as a standard, necessary meal didn't really exist for adults. The word itself, breakfast, literally means to break your fast, the fast you'd been holding overnight. But for most working people, this didn't happen first thing in the morning. The main meal of the day was dinner, which was eaten around noon. You'd get up and get straight to work. You'd labor in the fields or the workshop for several hours before you ate anything substantial. The church also discouraged eating too early, as it was seen as a form of gluttony. The only people who regularly ate breakfast were children, the elderly, the sick, and laborers doing incredibly physically demanding work who needed the extra fuel. And what did that breakfast consist of? Usually, it was humble fare. A hunk of bread, rye or barley for the poor, wheat for the rich. Maybe a piece of cheese. And to wash it down, ale. Yes, beer for breakfast. It wasn't the high-alcohol craft IPA you might be thinking of. Small beer, or small ale, was low in alcohol, full of calories and carbohydrates, and, most importantly, it was generally safer to drink than water. Water from wells or rivers could be contaminated and make you sick. The process of brewing ale killed off most of the nasty bacteria. So, a peasant's breakfast, if they had one, was basically a chunk of bread and a pint of weak, watery beer. The original breakfast of champions. The medieval morning was not about leisurely waking up. It was about efficiency. Get up with the sun, thank God you're alive, get dressed, get to work. The day was for labor, and you didn't waste a single precious moment of daylight. Let's dig a little deeper into the food situation, because it reveals so much about the medieval world. We've established that breakfast was optional, but what about the other meals? The main event of the day was dinner, served around midday, between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. This was the big one, the meal that would power you through the rest of the day's labor. For the 90% of the population who were peasants, this meal was repetitive. The cornerstone of their diet was something called pottage. Imagine a thick, constantly simmering stew in a pot over the fire. You just keep adding to it. Whatever vegetables you had from your garden, onions, cabbage, garlic, peas, beans. You'd throw in grains like oats or barley to thicken it into a kind of savory porridge. Meat was a rare luxury. Maybe you'd get a bit of bacon or some salted pork to flavor the pot if you were lucky. But for the most part, pottage was it. Day in, day out. It was the medieval equivalent of having oatmeal for every meal, if oatmeal had opinions and a mild flavor of despair. Bread was the other staple. But not the fluffy, light bread we know. We're talking dense, dark, heavy loaves made from rye or barley. And here's a detail I love, they didn't always use plates. For the wealthy, you'd have plates of wood, pewter, or even silver. For everyone else, you often used a trencher. A trencher was a thick, flat slab of stale bread. You'd pile your food on top of it, and the bread would soak up all the juices. At the end of the meal, what do you do with your gravy-soaked plate bread? If you were really poor, you ate it. If you were slightly better off, you'd give it as a donation to the poor who waited outside the hall, or you'd feed it to your dogs. It was the original edible arrangement, but much, much sadder. Now, for the nobility, dinner was a different story entirely. It was theater. It was a display of wealth and power. You'd have multiple courses, sometimes dozens. And they loved exotic, flashy food. You'd see peacocks roasted and then redressed in their own feathers to look like they were still alive. You'd have swans, herons, and all sorts of birds we wouldn't even consider eating today. They loved heavily spiced food. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and especially pepper were astronomically expensive. They had to be imported all the way from Asia. So, using a lot of spice wasn't just about flavor, it was about screaming, "I am ridiculously rich." They also had a thing for making food look like other things. This was called a subtlety. You might have a sculpture made of marzipan depicting a biblical scene, or a meatloaf molded to look like a hedgehog. It was the medieval version of those hyperrealistic cakes you see on the internet. The final meal of the day was supper, which was a much lighter meal taken in the evening before bed. It might be leftovers from dinner, or just some bread, cheese, and more ale. But what you ate was also heavily dictated by the church calendar. There were numerous fast days throughout the year, every Friday, all of Lent, and other holy days. On these days, you couldn't eat meat or animal products like eggs and dairy. So what did you eat? Fish. This is why coastal and river towns thrived. But even inland, they'd eat preserved fish, salted, smoked, or pickled. And they got creative. Beavers, for some reason, were classified as fish by the church because they lived in the water. So, beaver tail was a popular Lenten dish. Puffin, a seabird, was also considered a fish. The theological gymnastics they performed to get around the rules were truly Olympic level. So your diet was determined by your class, your location, and your level of piety. For most, it was a monotonous struggle for calories. For the few, it was a spectacular, spicy, peacock-filled performance. And for everyone, it was washed down with a whole lot of beer. So you've eaten your trencher or your refeathered peacock. Let's go back to the process of getting dressed, because medieval fashion was less about comfort and more about being a walking billboard for your social status. And sometimes, it was just plain weird. Let's start with the pointy shoes. You've probably seen them in paintings. They were called krakows or polanes, and in the late 14th and 15th centuries, they became an absolute obsession for noblemen. The longer and pointier your shoe, the more important and fashionable you were. It got so out of hand that the points became ridiculously long, sometimes up to 2 feet long. You couldn't walk properly. They had to stuff the tips with moss or wool to keep their shape, and sometimes even attach a fine chain from the tip of the shoe to a garter around their knee just to keep from tripping over them. This was the height of non-functional fashion. It was a way of saying, I am so wealthy and important that I don't need to do any form of manual labor. I don't even need to be able to run from a fire. My shoes are that impractical. Of course, the church hated them, calling them devil's fingers and trying to ban them, which only made them more popular. For women, the must-have accessory was the headdress. And these could get equally insane. The hennin, that classic cone-shaped princess hat you see in fairy tales, was a real thing in the 15th century. They could be 3 feet high, with a long, flowing veil attached to the tip. They were so tall that women supposedly had to walk sideways through doorways. Again, it was all about status. A bigger, more elaborate headdress meant you were a big deal. And then there's the color. We have this drab, gray and brown image of the Middle Ages. And while peasants did wear a lot of undyed wool, the wealthy loved color. Bright, vibrant colors. But getting those colors was a difficult and expensive process. Dyes were made from plants, insects, and minerals. A brilliant red, made from the tiny Kermes insect, was worth a fortune. A deep blue from the woad plant was also highly prized. And purple, Tyrian purple, made from thousands of tiny sea snails, was literally worth more than its weight in gold. It was reserved for royalty. There were even laws, called sumptuary laws, that dictated who was allowed to wear what. A merchant's wife wasn't legally allowed to wear the same luxurious fabrics or colors as a duchess. Your clothes were your resume, your bank statement, and your family tree, all stitched together. And what about underwear? For men, it was a pair of linen brays, which looked like loose-fitting boxer shorts that they would tuck their hose into. For women, well, for a long time, they didn't really wear underwear. They wore a long linen shift or chemise under their dress, and that was it. The concept of panties or bloomers didn't come around until much, much later. The feeling of all this clothing would have been substantial. We're used to light, synthetic fabrics. Imagine being wrapped in multiple layers of wool. It would be heavy, probably itchy, and in the summer, incredibly hot. But it was also durable. A good wool tunic could last you a lifetime. So when you see a portrait from the 15th century, don't just see a funny hat or silly shoes. See a complex system of social signaling, a world of technological limitations, and a person wearing the medieval equivalent of a Lamborghini on their feet and their life savings dyed into their cloak. Now, let's address the elephant in every room of the past. The smell. We are obsessed with smelling good, or more accurately, smelling like nothing. We shower daily, we use deodorants, we wash our clothes constantly. The medieval world had a very, very different relationship with scent. Let's be blunt, it was a smelly place. Think about the sources of that smell. We already mentioned the chamber pots being emptied into the streets. So you have raw human sewage running in open gutters. Then you add animal waste. People lived in close quarters with their animals. Pigs, chickens, and geese roamed the streets. You had blacksmiths with their coal smoke, tanners with their vats of urine and animal hides, butchers with their offal and blood. The streets of a medieval city would have been an olfactory nightmare. And then there's personal hygiene. As we said, bathing wasn't a frequent activity. Water had to be hauled by hand and heated over a fire, which was a huge amount of work. So, people washed their hands and face, but a full body wash was a luxury. Public bathhouses existed, a holdover from the Romans, but they developed a reputation for being associated with prostitution and disease, so they fell out of favor in many places. The result was that people smelled like people. They smelled of sweat, of stale clothes, of the wood smoke that clung to everything. But here's the crucial thing, this was the baseline. It was normal. They wouldn't have been as offended by it as we would be, because it was simply the smell of life. They were, however, very aware of bad smells and good smells. They operated on something called the miasma theory of disease. They believed that diseases were caused by bad air or evil humors that you could inhale. A foul stench, like that from a swamp or a pile of rotting garbage, wasn't just unpleasant, it was considered literally dangerous to your health. So, how did they combat this? Not by eliminating the source of the smell, but by covering it up with a better, stronger smell. The wealthy would carry around pomanders, which were little metal balls filled with aromatic substances like ambergris, musk, cloves, or dried flowers. They'd hold these up to their noses when walking through a particularly stinky part of town, creating a little bubble of pleasant scent to protect them from the miasma. They'd strew sweet-smelling herbs like lavender and rosemary on the floors of their homes. When you entered a room, you'd crush them underfoot, releasing their fragrance. It was like having a giant, walk-on air freshener. Incense was burned constantly in churches, not just for religious reasons, but to purify the air and cover the scent of the great unwashed masses packed into the pews. Perfume was also a big deal, but it wasn't the delicate, alcohol-based spray we use today. It was thick, oil-based, and incredibly potent. And they didn't just dab it on their wrists. They would scent their clothes, their gloves, their furniture, even the letters they wrote. It was another form of status symbol. The ability to surround yourself with a cloud of expensive, exotic scent proved you were wealthy enough to keep the dangerous, foul-smelling world at bay. So while we strive to eliminate scent, they strove to manage it. Their world was a constant battle of smells, a symphony of the foul and the fragrant, where your very health was thought to depend on which one you were breathing in. It's a world where a flower didn't just smell nice, it smelled safe. This idea of bad air and keeping the body in balance leads us directly into the wonderfully bizarre world of medieval medicine. If you got sick in the Middle Ages, you didn't go to a doctor who would talk about viruses or bacteria. You went to a physician who would talk about your humors. This was the theory of humoralism, and it was the bedrock of Western medicine for over 2,000 years, from the ancient Greeks right up to the 19th century. The idea was this: your body contained four basic substances, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with an element: air, water, fire, earth, and a quality: hot, cold, wet, dry. A healthy person had all four of these humors in perfect balance. Sickness was caused by an imbalance, too much or too little of one humor. So, a doctor's job wasn't to kill a germ, but to rebalance your internal ecosystem. Let's say you had a fever. Your skin is hot and red. The doctor would diagnose you with an excess of blood, which was a hot and wet humor. The logical treatment: get rid of the excess blood. This is where bloodletting comes in. They would either open a vein with a lancet or cover you in leeches. They had incredibly detailed charts showing which vein to cut for which ailment. Got a headache? We'll bleed you from your arm. A toothache? Maybe a vein in your neck. They believed they were draining the sickness right out of you. If you were suffering from, say, a cough and a runny nose, you might be diagnosed with an excess of phlegm, a cold and wet humor. The treatment would involve things that were hot and dry to counteract it. You'd be prescribed spicy foods, like pepper and ginger, and told to stay warm and dry. Every illness, every food, every herb, every activity was categorized by its humoral properties. It was a grand, unified theory of everything related to the body. It was also, for the most part, completely and utterly wrong. But it made a certain kind of intuitive sense. The treatments were often creative. A doctor's main diagnostic tool was the urine chart. They would inspect a patient's urine with the intensity of a wine connoisseur. They'd check its color, its thickness, its sediment, and sometimes even its taste, comparing it to a detailed chart. The color of your pee could supposedly tell them which of your humors was out of whack. Surgery was a completely different profession, performed not by physicians but by barber surgeons. These were the guys who would cut your hair, shave your beard, and also pull your rotten teeth, set your broken bones, and amputate your gangrenous limbs. It was a trade, not an academic pursuit, and it was brutally practical. Anesthesia? That would be a swig of alcohol and a leather strap to bite down on. Their understanding of anatomy was limited, and their concept of hygiene was non-existent. The idea that invisible germs on a surgeon's hands or tools could cause infection was centuries away. If a wound got infected and full of pus, they often saw it as a good sign, calling it laudable pus and believing it was the body expelling the bad humors. Yet, it wasn't all leeches and luck. They had an extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, many of which we now know have real medicinal properties. They were skilled at setting bones and creating prosthetics. And they understood the importance of rest and diet in recovery. But at its core, medieval medicine was a system of logic based on a faulty premise. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaotic and terrifying reality of sickness and death in a world without germ theory. Your doctor wasn't a scientist in the modern sense, he was a master of balancing your personal, internal four-part stew. So, you've somehow managed to survive the questionable food and the even more questionable medicine. What did you do for fun? In a world without television, without the internet, without even widespread literacy, how did people entertain themselves? The answer is, in all sorts of ways, ranging from the deeply pious to the shockingly brutal. First and foremost, there was the church. And I know what you're thinking, boring. But the church was the center of social life. The church calendar dictated the rhythm of the year. It wasn't just Sundays. There were dozens of saints' days and holy days throughout the year, which were holidays. These were days off from work. And they were celebrated with feasts, processions, and revelry. Major holidays like Christmas and Easter were multi-day affairs of feasting and celebration. On certain feast days, the world turned upside down. On the Feast of Fools, a junior clergyman would be elected Lord of Misrule and would mock the church hierarchy. It was a form of sanctioned chaos, a way to blow off steam before returning to the rigid social order. Churches also put on mystery plays, which were dramatic retellings of Bible stories. These were the blockbuster movies of their day. Entire towns would participate, with different guilds being responsible for different scenes. The Shipwrights Guild might build Noah's Ark, and the Bakers' Guild might stage the Last Supper. They were huge, elaborate, and often very funny and moving. If you were a noble, your idea of fun might be a tournament. These started as serious military training exercises but evolved into elaborate sporting events. You'd have knights jousting, trying to knock each other off their horses with lances. It was the medieval equivalent of Formula One racing, complete with superstars, groupies, and spectacular crashes. It was incredibly dangerous, and knights were often seriously injured or killed, but the glory and prize money were immense. For the common folk, entertainment was a bit more rustic. Taverns and alehouses were the social hubs of any village or town. This is where you'd go after a long day's work to drink, gossip, play games like chess or dice, and maybe listen to a traveling minstrel sing songs about heroic knights or bawdy encounters. Music was everywhere. People sang while they worked, they sang in church, they sang in the tavern. A pipe, a drum, a lute, these were the sounds of celebration. And then there was the blood sport. Medieval people had a stomach for violence and cruelty that is shocking to us. Bear baiting was a hugely popular spectator sport. A bear would be chained to a post, and trained dogs would be set on it. People would bet on which dog would last the longest or if the bear would win. Cockfighting was another favorite. It was brutal, bloody, and to them, utterly thrilling. Public executions were also a form of mass entertainment. People would take the day off work to go and watch. It was a combination of grim justice, religious morality play, and a good old-fashioned spectacle. The line between entertainment and everyday life was blurry. A wedding was a huge party. A traveling merchant coming to town was a major event. A public punishment in the stocks was a source of drama and amusement. In a world with less prescribed entertainment, people found it everywhere, in religion, in sport, in violence, and most of all, in each other's company. Their fun was loud, communal, and often, to our eyes, incredibly strange. Let's circle back for a moment to the very thing that structured this entire world, time itself. Our relationship with time is rigid, precise, and obsessive. We live by the minute and the second. Our lives are governed by digital clocks, by deadlines, by schedules planned weeks in advance. The medieval concept of time was organic. It was squishy. It was natural. For the average person, the most important timekeepers were the sun and the church bells. The day was divided not into 24 equal hours, but into the canonical hours of the church. Monks in monasteries had to pray at specific times throughout the day and night, and they would ring bells to mark these times. Matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime, terce, sext at noon, none, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. For the villagers living near a church or monastery, these bells were the clock that governed their lives. The bell for sext told you it was midday and time for dinner. The bell for vespers told you the workday was ending. You didn't need a watch, you just needed to be able to hear the church. The hours themselves were not of a fixed length. In the summer, the daylight hours were long, so each hour of daylight was longer. In the winter, the daylight hours were short, so the hours were shorter. They were measuring a portion of the available light, not a fixed, abstract unit of 60 minutes. This seems bizarre to us, but it's perfectly logical for an agricultural society. Your work is dictated by sunlight. You work from sunup to sundown. It doesn't matter if that's 16 hours in June or 8 hours in December. The task remains the same. The seasons, not the clock, were the ultimate authority. The year was a cycle of plowing, sowing, growing, and harvesting. It was punctuated by the great religious festivals, the bleak fasting of Lent, the joyous feast of Easter, the long, slow work of summer leading to the harvest festivals, and the dark, cold waiting of Advent before the explosion of light and food at Christmas. Life was cyclical, not linear. They weren't racing against the clock, they were moving with the rhythms of the world around them. Of course, mechanical clocks did exist. They started appearing in the towers of Italian cities in the late 13th century. But they were rare, expensive, and not very accurate. They were symbols of civic pride and wealth more than practical timekeeping devices for the average person. It wasn't until the proliferation of personal watches in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the demands of the Industrial Revolution with its factory whistles and train schedules, that our modern, frantic, clock-dominated consciousness was born. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how we worked, it fundamentally changed how we slept. The new factories required workers to be present for long, continuous shifts. You couldn't just take a 2-hour break in the middle of your shift to pray and chat. You had to conform to the rhythm of the machine, not the rhythm of the sun. And with the widespread adoption of gaslight and then electric light, we conquered the night. We could work, travel, and socialize 24/7. The long, dark, boring nights that forced our ancestors into their 2 sleeps were gone. The night became just another part of the day, to be filled with activity. And so, biphasic sleep faded away. By the early 20th century, it was so completely forgotten that when people in the 1990s started waking up in the middle of the night, doctors diagnosed it as a sleep disorder, not realizing they were just experiencing the faint, ancestral echo of a pattern that was normal for all of human history. So, after all this, after the 2 sleeps, the shared beds, the beer for breakfast, the pottage, the pointy shoes, the humoral doctors, and the squishy, bell-driven sense of time, what does it all really mean? What does this strange, half-familiar, half-alien world tell us about our ancestors, and more importantly, about ourselves? The first, and most obvious takeaway, is that our modern way of life is the historical anomaly. Our brightly lit, rigidly scheduled, deeply individualistic world is the weird one. For most of human history, life was dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the community. We've traded the communal messiness of the shared bed for the sterile privacy of our own rooms. We've exchanged the natural, cyclical rhythm of biphasic sleep for the harsh, unyielding demand of the 8-hour block. We've swapped the constant, low-level social interaction of a small community for the isolated connectivity of the internet. It's not a judgment, just an observation. We gained hygiene, but we lost a certain kind of raw, unfiltered community. We gained efficiency, but we lost a connection to the natural cycles of light and dark. Perhaps the more profound takeaway is about human adaptability and ingenuity. The people of the past weren't stupid. They were building a world and a culture with the tools they had. Humoral theory seems insane to us, but it was a genuine, logical attempt to understand the human body in the absence of microscopes. Sleeping in 2 shifts wasn't a choice, it was a brilliant adaptation to the reality of a world without artificial light. Using a piece of bread as a plate is a clever solution when pottery is a luxury. Every strange custom, every bizarre belief, was their best answer to the fundamental questions of life: how do we stay warm? How do we stay fed? How do we heal ourselves? How do we find meaning in a world that is often dark, dangerous, and confusing? And in their answers, we can see a reflection of our own struggles. They worried about their health, they worried about their souls, they gossiped about their neighbors, they loved their children, and they looked for ways to have a bit of fun. They lived in a world of miasma and mystery plays, but their fundamental human desires were the same as ours. They were just people, trying to make it through the darkness, one weird, interrupted night at a time. But just when you think you have a handle on them, on their smelly, superstitious, sleep-interrupted lives, you realize we've only been talking about how they survived the day. We haven't even really touched on the things that truly drove them, the things that kept them up during that waking watch, thinking and worrying. The fundamental human stuff: love, family, and the fear of getting on the wrong side of the law, or the wrong side of God. So, if you're still with me, maybe grab another drink. Let's pull back another layer of the medieval curtain and peek into their hearts and their fears. This is where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about love and marriage. And the first thing you need to do is take our modern, Hollywood-infused idea of romantic love, put it in a small box, and set that box on fire. For the vast majority of medieval people, especially anyone with a scrap of property or status, marriage had very little to do with love. It was a business transaction. It was a strategic alliance. It was a corporate merger with less paperwork and more plague. For the nobility, a marriage was about consolidating land, forging political alliances, and ending wars. A daughter was a geopolitical asset, a son was a way to continue the dynasty. The feelings of the two teenagers being pushed down the aisle were, at best, a secondary concern. At worst, they were completely irrelevant. The key component of this transaction was the dowry. This was the wealth, money, land, goods, that a bride's family gave to the groom's family upon marriage. A big dowry could elevate a family's status, while a small one could be a source of shame. The negotiations were intense and brutally practical, like hammering out the details of a trade deal. But what about the common folk? Surely the humble peasant could marry for love? Sometimes, yes. But even at the lower rungs of society, marriage was deeply practical. A farmer needed a wife who was strong, healthy, and could run a household, manage a garden, and produce children who would one day help with the farm work. A woman looked for a husband who had a bit of land or a good trade, someone who could provide for and protect a family. It was a partnership, a two-person corporation for the purpose of survival. The church had to give its blessing, of course, and you couldn't marry your cousin, which was a surprisingly frequent problem in the tiny, isolated gene pool of a medieval village. So where does love fit in? Well, the hope was that love, or at least a deep, abiding affection and respect, would grow after the marriage. You were building a life together, facing hardship together, raising children together. That shared experience was the soil in which love could potentially blossom. But what about passion? Romance? That burning, all-consuming desire you read about in stories? That was a concept called courtly love. And here's the truly bizarre part, courtly love almost never involved your spouse. It was a highly stylized, elaborate game of flirtation and devotion, usually between a knight and a high-born lady who was, crucially, married to someone else. The knight would pledge his service to her, wear her colors in tournaments, write her poetry, and suffer gloriously in her name. The lady, in turn, would be his inspiration, his guiding star. It was intensely romantic, deeply emotional, and in theory, completely chaste. It was about longing, not fulfillment. It was a way to experience all the thrilling highs of romantic passion without upsetting the very practical, very unromantic business of actual marriage. Of course, whether it always stayed chaste is a matter of historical debate. But the very existence of courtly love tells you everything you need to know. Marriage was for property and progeny, love was a beautiful, dangerous game you played on the side. This brings us, inevitably, to the medieval bedroom. And if you thought the church was involved in your diet and your holidays, just wait until you see how involved it was in your sex life. The medieval church was, to put it mildly, obsessed with sex. They saw it as a necessary evil. It was essential for procreation, to make more little Christian souls, but it was also deeply tied to the sin of lust. So, their goal was to create a rulebook, a spiritual, terms and conditions, for marital intimacy, that would minimize the sin and maximize the procreation. It was less about joy and more about, holy productivity. First, there was the question of when. You couldn't just have sex whenever you felt like it. That would be lustful. There were a staggering number of forbidden days. You couldn't have sex on Sundays, because it was the Lord's Day. You couldn't do it on Wednesdays or Fridays, which were fast days. You couldn't do it on any of the numerous saints' days or feast days. You were absolutely forbidden during the entire 40 days of Lent, during Advent, and during Pentecost. You also couldn't do it if the woman was pregnant, or breastfeeding, or during her period. When you add it all up, for a significant portion of the year, sex was completely off the table. The church was the celestial referee constantly blowing the whistle on the game. Then there was the question of why. The only legitimate reason for sex was to have children. Any other reason, pleasure, comfort, affection, was veering into sinful territory. Some theologians argued that if you had sex purely for pleasure, even with your own spouse, it was a mortal sin. It was the ultimate buzzkill. And finally, there was the how. Oh yes, they had rules for that too. Priests' manuals, called penitentials, had long, detailed lists of forbidden sexual acts and the penances required for them. The only approved position was the one they believed was most effective for conception and least likely to cause pleasure, which was, you guessed it, the missionary position. Anything else, woman on top, from behind, standing up, was condemned as unnatural, animalistic, and sinful. The penances could be severe, years of fasting on bread and water. The church was acting like a kind of overbearing, celestial homeowners association for your bedroom, regulating everything from the timing to the aesthetics. Now, we have to ask the obvious question, did anyone actually follow all these rules? The answer is almost certainly not. We have evidence from folk songs, poems, and court records that people were a lot more inventive and a lot less pious in private than the church wanted them to be. But the rules still mattered. They created a pervasive sense of guilt and anxiety around one of the most fundamental human acts. It meant that for the medieval person, even the most intimate moments of their life were being watched and judged by God. Every desire had to be weighed against the threat of eternal damnation. It adds a whole new layer to that waking watch at 1 a.m., not just reflecting on your dreams, but maybe calculating if you have enough holy days banked to make up for last Tuesday night. From the courtroom of God, let's move to the courtrooms of men. What happened when you broke the secular laws? What was medieval justice like? In a word, terrifying. We live in a world of forensic science, of DNA evidence, of a legal system based on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. The medieval world had none of that. Evidence was often scarce, and their methods for determining guilt or innocence could be, let's just say, they were creative. Let's imagine a crime has been committed. A cow has been stolen. There's no police force to call. Instead, the victim would raise the hue and cry. They'd literally start shouting, and it was the legal duty of everyone in the village who heard the cry to stop what they were doing, grab a pitchfork or a club, and join the chase. It was a community-based, instant response posse. If you didn't join in, you could be fined. It was everyone's problem. Now, let's say they catch a suspect. How do you prove he did it? If there were witnesses, great. But what if it's just one person's word against another's? This is where you get into the wild world of the ordeal. The ordeal was a way of outsourcing the verdict to a higher power. It was basically asking God to perform a little miracle to prove who was telling the truth. There were several popular types. In the ordeal by fire, the accused would have to hold a red-hot piece of iron and walk a few steps, or pluck a stone from a pot of boiling water. Their hand would be bandaged, and then unbandaged 3 days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, God had declared them innocent. If it was festering and infected, guilty. In the ordeal by water, the accused would be tied up and thrown into a river or pond that had been blessed by a priest. If they sank, the holy water was accepting them, and they were innocent, and quickly fished out, hopefully. If they floated, the water was rejecting them. Guilty. It was a 50-50 shot, with God as the judge and basic physics as the prosecutor. For the nobility, there was a more dignified option, trial by combat. The accuser and the accused, or champions hired to fight on their behalf, would just beat the holy heck out of each other. The winner was deemed to be in the right, because it was believed that God would grant victory to the truthful party. It was a lawsuit settled with swords. If you were found guilty, the punishments were designed to be brutal, public, and memorable. Fines were common, but for more serious crimes, you were looking at physical punishment. You might be put in the stocks or the pillory in the center of town, where your neighbors could mock you and pelt you with rotten vegetables and dead animals for a day. Humiliation was a key part of the punishment. For criminals, you had branding with a hot iron, mutilation like having a hand or an ear cut off, or flogging. The death penalty was common, and it was a public spectacle. Hanging was the standard, but for the most heinous crimes, like treason, you had the truly gruesome punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was justice as theater, a horrific morality play designed to terrify the population into obedience. It was a system built not on evidence, but on faith, community pressure, and a healthy dose of pure, unadulterated fear. So in this world of strict rules, harsh justice, and constant hardship, what was it like to be a child? Again, forget your modern notions of a precious, protected childhood. The medieval world did not see childhood as a unique, special phase of life. They saw children, essentially, as miniature, incompetent adults. The biggest hurdle of medieval childhood was simply surviving it. Historians estimate that as many as 1/3 to 1/2 of all children died before the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents were rampant. Surviving infancy was your first great victory. Once you were past that danger zone, your childhood was short. There wasn't a long period of play and schooling. Play happened, of course. We found archaeological evidence of toys like wooden swords, dolls, and knucklebones. Kids played games, they ran around, they got into trouble. But their primary purpose was to prepare for their adult roles as quickly as possible. For most children, work began as soon as they were physically able. A peasant child would be helping in the fields, scaring birds away from the crops, or tending to the chickens from the age of 6 or 7. A girl would be learning to spin, weave, cook, and manage a household from her mother, skills that were essential for her future as a wife. The concept of formal education was a privilege reserved for the very few. If you were the son of a nobleman, you might be taught by a private tutor or a priest. You'd learn to read and write, usually in Latin, do some arithmetic, and learn the arts of war. The main path to education for a commoner was through the church. A bright boy from a poor family might be sent to a monastery to become a monk, where he would receive a rigorous education. But for the vast majority of the population, life was the only school they ever attended. Around the age of 7 or 8, many children would be sent away from home. A nobleman's son might be sent to another lord's castle to serve as a page, learning courtly manners and combat skills. A peasant boy might be sent to a nearby town to become an apprentice to a craftsman. This apprenticeship was a formal contract. The boy would live with the master craftsman for 7 years, working in exchange for room, board, and training in a trade like baking, blacksmithing, or carpentry. It was a tough life, often with long hours and harsh discipline, essentially a 7-year unpaid internship with more beatings. By their mid-teens, these children were considered adults. They were working full-time, they could be married, and they were expected to carry the full responsibilities of their station. Childhood was a brief, precarious prologue to a life of hard labor. There was affection, there was love between parents and children, but the sentimental view of childhood as a magical, carefree time simply did not exist. A child was a future laborer, another mouth to feed, and a soul to be saved, and there was no time to waste in molding them for that reality. Given this harsh reality, this constant proximity to death, disease, and hardship, it's no surprise that the medieval mind was also deeply intertwined with a world that we would call supernatural. For them, it wasn't supernatural. It was just natural. The world was enchanted, alive with invisible forces, both holy and demonic. The line between the physical and the spiritual was thin, porous, and easily crossed. Everyone, from the most learned theologian to the humblest peasant, believed in magic, in demons, in angels, in ghosts, and in a whole host of other beings that inhabited the world alongside them. God and the devil were not abstract concepts, they were active participants in daily life. A sudden storm that ruined the crops could be the work of a demon. A miraculous recovery from illness could be the intervention of a saint. The world was a constant battleground between the forces of good and evil, and you were caught in the middle. Beyond the grand Christian cosmology, there was a rich and ancient world of folk belief. People believed in fairies or the good folk, but these weren't the cute, winged pixies of Victorian England. They were powerful, dangerous, and capricious beings who lived in the woods, in ancient hills, and under bodies of water. You had to be careful not to offend them. You might leave out a bowl of milk for them to keep them happy, but you would never thank them directly, as it might give them power over you. They were known to steal babies from their cribs and replace them with changelings, and to lure travelers off the path to their doom. The woods at night were not just dark and scary, they were actively malevolent, filled with things that did not wish you well. Witches were also a very real fear, long before the great witch hunts of the early modern period. A witch was someone who used demonic magic to harm others. They could curdle milk, cause impotence, blight crops, or bring sickness upon your children. To protect yourself, you relied on a mixture of official religion and folk magic. You'd go to church and pray, but you might also carry a protective charm, an amulet with a Bible verse written on it, or a piece of rowan wood to ward off evil. You might carve symbols on the threshold of your house to prevent evil spirits from entering. The village, cunning man, or wise woman, was a key figure. They were the local practitioners of folk magic, a combination of herbalist, veterinarian, and magical problem solver. If your cow was sick, you might go to them for a charm. If you suspected you'd been cursed, they'd help you find a way to break it. The church had a complicated relationship with these figures. On one hand, it was unsanctioned magic. On the other hand, it was often the only form of medicine or psychological comfort available to the poor. This belief in an enchanted world explains so much about their mindset. It was a world full of wonder, but also full of terror. Every unexplained event had a supernatural cause. It meant you were never truly alone, but it also meant you were constantly being watched, by saints, angels, demons, and fairies. It was a worldview that provided an explanation for everything, but it was an explanation steeped in a deep and abiding fear of the unknown, and of the things that go bump in the very, very dark night. And eventually, for everyone, that long, dark night would come to a final end. Let's talk about the last great event of a medieval life, death. In our modern world, death is something we try very hard to hide. It happens in hospitals, behind closed doors. It's medicalized, sanitized, and spoken of in hushed tones. For the medieval person, death was everywhere, all the time. It was public, it was familiar, and it was the single most important event of your life. With such high mortality rates, everyone had witnessed death, probably many times, from a young age. They had seen siblings die in infancy, parents taken by plague, neighbors killed in accidents. Death was not a stranger, it was a constant, looming neighbor. Because of this, they spent a lot of time preparing for it. There was a whole genre of literature called the ars moriendi, the art of dying. These were manuals that taught you how to die a good death. A good death was one where you were prepared. You had time to confess your sins to a priest, to receive the last rites, to say goodbye to your family, and to put your affairs in order. The worst kind of death was a sudden one, being struck by lightning, falling off a horse, because it gave you no time to prepare your soul for judgment. The moment of death itself was a public event. The dying person would be in their bed, surrounded by family, friends, and neighbors. It was a communal ritual. They were there to offer comfort, but also to witness the final struggle. They believed that at the moment of death, demons and angels would literally gather around the bed to battle for the person's soul. The final moments were the most crucial. After death, the body would be washed and wrapped in a simple shroud by the women of the family. The funeral would happen quickly, usually within a day or two, because embalming was not a common practice. The funeral mass was less about celebrating the life of the deceased and more about praying for their soul's journey through the afterlife. And the afterlife was everything. Their entire lives were lived in the context of what would happen after they died. Heaven was the ultimate goal, a paradise of eternal bliss in the presence of God. Hell was the ultimate terror, a place of eternal, unimaginable torment ruled by Satan. But for most people, the immediate destination was neither of these. It was purgatory. Purgatory was a sort of spiritual waiting room, a place where the souls of those who died in a state of grace but were still tainted by minor, unconfessed sins went to be purified. You'd be purged by fire, suffering until you were clean enough to be admitted to heaven. The time you spent in purgatory could be shortened by the prayers of the living. This is why people left money in their wills to pay for priests to say masses for their souls, or for the poor to pray for them. Your connection to your community didn't end at death. The living had a job to do, to help you on your journey. This constant awareness of death, this focus on the afterlife, shaped their entire worldview. It's why they endured such hardship with a kind of grim fatalism. This life was just a temporary, painful trial, a brief and difficult pilgrimage. The real destination, the real life, was the one that came after. It gave them meaning, it gave them hope, but it also filled them with a profound and ever-present anxiety about the state of their immortal soul. So, here we are, at the end of our long journey through the medieval night and into the medieval mind. We started with a simple question: why did people sleep in 2 shifts? And we found an answer rooted in the simple reality of darkness and light. But that one strange habit turned out to be a key, unlocking a door into a world that is almost unrecognizably different from our own. A world where your bed was a public space and your soul was a private battlefield. Where time bent with the seasons, and justice was decided by a hot piece of iron. Where your food was your plate, your doctor was balancing your internal fluids, and your love life was governed by a rulebook of cosmic proportions. It's a world that can seem backward, brutal, and suffocatingly superstitious. And in many ways, it was. But to dismiss it as just a dark age is to miss the point. This was a world held together by a completely different set of assumptions. Their foundational belief was not in science, or progress, or the individual. It was in God, in the community, and in a rigid, hierarchical order that they believed was divinely ordained. Every aspect of their lives, from their sleeping patterns to their art of dying, was built upon that foundation. What we see as superstition, they saw as the fabric of reality. What we see as a lack of privacy, they saw as the strength of community. What we see as a squandering of time in prayer, they saw as the most important work a human could do. In a way, they lived in a world with a terrible kind of certainty. They were certain of their place in the universe, certain of what happened after death, and certain of the rules they needed to follow. We, in our modern, brightly lit world, have traded that certainty for knowledge. We know what causes disease, we know the earth revolves around the sun, and we know how to measure a second with atomic precision. But we've also inherited a universe that is vast, impersonal, and silent on the questions of meaning and purpose. We sleep through the night, but perhaps we, too, have our own version of the waking watch, that 3 a.m. anxiety fest, where we lie in the quiet of our private rooms and wonder what it's all for. The medieval world is not just a collection of weird facts and funny costumes. It's a mirror. A dark, distorted, and sometimes terrifying mirror, but a mirror nonetheless. And in it, we can see the reflection of a different way of being human, and perhaps, catch a glimpse of the ghosts of the beliefs and the rhythms that we, ourselves, have long since forgotten. And that, in the end, is history. Absolutely. It seems we're not done with our journey just yet. The fire in the hearth is still glowing, and there are a few more dusty, forgotten rooms in this medieval house of ours to explore. We've talked about the person, the individual, struggling with their sleep, their soul, and the occasional pointy shoe. But that person didn't exist in a vacuum. They were a tiny cog in a series of vast, intricate, and often brutal machines that dictated their every move. The machines of power, of faith, and of war. So, if you're comfortable, let's zoom out. Let's look at the very architecture of their world, the unwritten rules and the ironclad structures that made them who they were. This is the operating system of the medieval world, and trust me, it's full of bugs, bizarre features, and a user agreement you really wouldn't want to sign. Let's start with the biggest, most defining feature of medieval society, a concept we all vaguely remember from school: feudalism. Now, the word itself sounds incredibly dull. It sounds like a tax form. But I want you to think of it less as a system of government and more as the world's most complicated, high-stakes, multi-level marketing scheme. Or maybe the mafia. Yeah, let's go with the mafia. At the very top, you have the godfather, the king. He technically owns all the land, the whole territory. But he can't manage it all himself. It's too big. So, he calls in his top capos, his most powerful nobles, dukes, earls, barons. He says, listen, I'm gonna give you this huge chunk of land, a fief. You can run it, you can tax the people on it, you can be the big boss of that territory. In return, you owe me. You owe me loyalty. And more importantly, when I get into a war, you have to show up with a specified number of soldiers, knights, all kitted out and ready to fight. You're my muscle. This is the deal. This promise was sealed with an oath of fealty, a deeply serious, sacred vow made before God. So, the dukes and earls now have their land. But it's still too much for them to manage. So what do? They repeat the process. They call in their soldiers, the lower-level lords and knights, and they say, all right, I'm gonna give you this manor, this village, this patch of dirt. You can be the local boss. In return, you owe me your military service. You are my personal bodyguard, my enforcer. When my boss, the duke, calls me up for a war, I'm calling you. It was a giant chain of personal, military obligation, cascading down from the king. Everyone owed service to the person above them, and everyone offered protection to the person below them. Now, where do the actual people, the 90% who do all the work, fit in? They're at the bottom. They are the serfs. And it's crucial to understand that a serf was not a slave. A slave is property, they can be bought and sold. A serf couldn't be sold. But they also weren't free. They were legally tied to the land they worked. They were part of the real estate. If the lord sold his manor, the serfs came with it, like the barns and the fences. They couldn't leave without the lord's permission. They couldn't get married without his permission. They had to work on the lord's personal fields for a certain number of days a week for free. This was their rent. On top of that, they had to pay taxes, a portion of their own crops, a pig at Christmas, a dozen eggs at Easter. They had to use the lord's mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, and his winepress for their grapes, and pay a fee for each use. It was a system designed to extract the maximum amount of labor and resources from the bottom to support the fighting class at the top. Social mobility? Forget about it. You were born a peasant, you died a peasant. Your children would be peasants. Your destiny was written in the dirt you plowed. It was a world built on obligation, not freedom, on loyalty, not law. And just like the mafia, it was all held together by a combination of sacred oaths and the unspoken threat that if you broke the rules, someone with a much bigger sword than you would come to visit. But it wasn't all just muddy fields and drafty castles. Another world was slowly, but surely, emerging from within this rigid feudal system, the town. If the countryside was the embodiment of old-world obligation, the town was the noisy, smelly, chaotic hub of New World opportunity. Medieval towns and cities were a world apart. Many of them had charters, legal documents granted by a king or a powerful lord that gave them a degree of self-governance. They had their own councils, their own courts, their own taxes. There was a famous German saying, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes you free. Legally, if a serf could escape from their manor and live within the walls of a town for a year and a day without being caught by their lord, they were declared a free man. This made towns powerful magnets for the ambitious and the desperate. But life in a town was no paradise. It was crowded. The streets were narrow, unpaved alleys choked with mud, garbage, and animal waste. Houses were built of timber and packed so tightly together that fire was a constant, terrifying threat. It was loud. The church bells rang out the hours, merchants shouted to advertise their wares, hammers clanged in blacksmith shops, and cartwheels rumbled over the cobblestones. And the lifeblood of the town was commerce, which was ruthlessly controlled by the guilds. A guild was 1 part trade union, 1 part professional association, and 1 part secret society. You had a guild for every conceivable trade: the weavers, the bakers, the shoemakers, the masons, the goldsmiths. The guilds set the rules. They controlled the quality of goods, they set the prices, and most importantly, they controlled who was allowed to practice that trade. You couldn't just open a bakery. You had to join the Bakers' Guild first. To do that, you had to go through a long and arduous process. You'd start as an apprentice, a young boy living with a master craftsman for 7 years, learning the trade. After your apprenticeship, you became a journeyman, traveling and working for other masters to hone your skills. Finally, to become a master yourself, you had to produce a masterpiece, a piece of work so fine that it proved to the other masters of the guild that you were worthy of joining their ranks. It was a system that guaranteed quality, but it also stifled competition and innovation. It created a new kind of hierarchy, not of blood and land like in the feudal system, but of skill and wealth. This was the birth of the middle class: merchants, master craftsmen, and bankers who might not have a noble title, but whose wealth was starting to give them a new kind of power, a power that would, over centuries, begin to chip away at the foundations of the old feudal world. Of course, all this land, all this wealth, all this structure had to be defended. The primary job of the nobility, the very reason for their existence in the feudal system, was to fight. And medieval warfare is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the era. The first thing to get out of your head is the image of 2 massive armies lining up in a field and having a glorious, heroic battle. Those kinds of pitched battles, like Hastings or Agincourt, were actually quite rare. They were incredibly risky, an all-or-nothing gamble that most commanders tried to avoid. For most of the medieval period, war wasn't about battles, it was about castles. Castles were the tanks, the aircraft carriers of their day. They were instruments of power projection. You built a castle to control the surrounding land, its resources, and its people. Therefore, the most common form of warfare was the siege. A siege was a slow, brutal, grinding affair. An attacking army would surround a castle and try to starve the defenders into submission. This could take months, even years. Life in a siege camp was miserable. You had thousands of soldiers packed together in unsanitary conditions. Disease, like dysentery, would often kill more soldiers than combat. The attackers would build huge siege engines, catapults called trebuchets that could hurl massive stones, dead animals, or even severed heads over the castle walls to break down the defenses and spread terror and disease. The defenders, meanwhile, would be rationing their food and water, enduring constant bombardment, and praying for a relief army to arrive. And what about the knights? The shining heroes in armor? Let's deglamorize that a bit. First, being a knight was astronomically expensive. A full suit of plate armor in the 15th century was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It was custom-fitted and could cost as much as a luxury car today. Then you needed a warhorse, also incredibly expensive, plus other horses for travel, plus a squire to help you with your gear, plus weapons and a tent. You were a walking, riding, one-man fortune. The armor itself was incredibly heavy and hot. It offered fantastic protection, but it also restricted your movement and your vision. If you fell off your horse in the mud, you could be as helpless as an overturned turtle, and you might even drown. The romantic ideal of chivalry, the code of conduct that knights were supposed to follow, was often just that, an ideal. In reality, war was savage. The goal was often to capture enemy knights and hold them for a huge ransom. They were valuable assets. The poor infantry soldier, however, was disposable. And then, in the later Middle Ages, a weapon came along that changed everything: the English longbow. A longbowman, a peasant with a stick of yew wood and years of training, could shoot an arrow that could punch through a knight's expensive armor from 200 yards away. At battles like Crécy and Agincourt, thousands of French knights, the flower of chivalry, were cut down by waves of arrows shot by low-born English archers. It was a technological revolution that spelled the beginning of the end for the age of the knight, and it was a brutal reminder that in war, glory is a myth, survival is the only prize. Running parallel to this entire system of lords and peasants and knights was another power structure, one that was in many ways even more powerful, more pervasive, and more wealthy than any king, the Church. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages wasn't just a religious institution. It was a multinational corporation, a parallel government, and a cultural superpower all rolled into one. At the top of this vast pyramid was the Pope in Rome. The Pope was not just a spiritual leader, he was a major political player. He commanded armies, he made treaties with kings, and he had a weapon that was, in many ways, more powerful than any army: excommunication. To be excommunicated was to be kicked out of the church. For a king, this was a disaster. It meant that his soul was damned to hell, and more importantly, it meant that all the oaths of fealty that his subjects had sworn to him were now null and void. The Pope could essentially deplatform a king, giving his enemies a holy license to rebel against him. This gave the papacy immense power to influence the politics of Europe. The Church was also the largest single landowner in all of Europe. Through centuries of gifts and bequests from the faithful, it had accumulated a staggering amount of land and wealth. It levied its own tax, the tithe, which was a mandatory 10% payment from all Christians. This made it fabulously rich and, at times, deeply corrupt. But the Church's power wasn't just political and economic. It was total. It was the sole provider of almost all social services. Monasteries and convents ran the only hospitals, the only orphanages, and the only inns for travelers. Monks were the scholars of the age. In their libraries, called scriptoriums, they painstakingly copied and preserved the texts of ancient Rome and Greece, keeping the candle of knowledge from being completely extinguished. The Church controlled education through its cathedral schools and the newly emerging universities. It controlled art and architecture. The great Gothic cathedrals that soared towards the heavens were the most ambitious and expensive projects of the entire era. And, of course, it controlled your soul. From the moment you were baptized to the moment you received your last rites, the Church was the sole gatekeeper to salvation. There was no other option. To challenge the Church's doctrine was to commit heresy, the worst possible crime, and the Church created a special institution to hunt down and eliminate heretics, the Inquisition. Its methods of interrogation and torture were brutal, and the punishment was to be burned at the stake. For the medieval person, the Church was like the air they breathed. It was everywhere, it was inescapable, and its power reached from the grandest throne room in Europe right down into the most secret corners of your heart. With all this land, all these wars, and all these cathedrals being built, how did anyone pay for anything? Let's talk about the medieval economy, because it was a strange and wonderfully messy thing. First of all, for a huge portion of the population, money as we know it barely mattered. A serf living on a manor existed mostly in a world of barter and obligation. They paid their rent in labor and in produce, not in cash. The small amount of money they might have earned from selling a few extra eggs at the market would go towards paying a church tax or a fine to their lord. The actual coins in circulation were a confusing disaster. There was no single, unified currency. Every major lord, every duke, every king could mint their own coins. So you'd have a chaotic mix of English pennies, French livres, Florentine florins, all with different weights and different values of silver or gold. A traveling merchant had to be an expert in currency exchange just to do business. Because of this, large-scale trade often relied on credit, on letters of exchange that could be carried long distances more safely than a chest full of gold. But there was a huge problem with credit, a problem rooted in religion. The Church condemned usury, which at the time meant lending money at any interest at all. This was considered a grave sin. Earning money from money, without doing any actual labor, was seen as unnatural and immoral. This created a massive economic problem. How do you fund a big business venture, or how does a king pay for a war, if you can't borrow money? This religious rule created an economic opening for one specific group, Jewish communities. Since Jewish law did not forbid them from lending money to non-Jews, they were able to step in and become the bankers and moneylenders of Europe. This was a vital service that fueled the medieval economy, but it came at a terrible price. It made Jewish communities both indispensable and deeply resented. They were often protected by kings and lords who needed their services, but they were also hated by the general populace who saw them as sinful usurers and outsiders. This resentment would often boil over into horrific waves of persecution and violence. The real engine of the medieval economy, the place where all this came together, was the Great Trade Fair. Fairs were like a medieval mashup of a Super Bowl, a G7 summit, and Amazon Prime Day. They were huge, scheduled events that would last for weeks, and merchants would travel from all over the known world to attend. You could buy English wool, Flemish cloth, French wine, Italian silks, and spices from the Far East. It was where international business got done, where new ideas were exchanged, and where the isolation of medieval life was briefly, spectacularly broken. It was a vibrant, chaotic glimpse of a growing, interconnected world, a world increasingly being run not just by swords and prayers, but by the quiet, relentless power of coin. Now, after hearing all of this, the rigid hierarchy, the brutal warfare, the superstitious beliefs, the all-powerful church, it's easy to fall back on that old stereotype of this entire period being the Dark Ages. An age of ignorance and stagnation between the glories of Rome and the rebirth of the Renaissance. And while there's no denying the hardship and the brutality, that picture is fundamentally incomplete. To call it the Dark Ages is to ignore the incredible sparks of innovation, ingenuity, and beauty that lit up the medieval world. Let's start on the farm. Sometime around the 10th century, a series of agricultural innovations created a revolution. The invention of the heavy plow, with its iron blade and moldboard, allowed farmers to cultivate the thick, clay-rich soils of northern Europe for the first time. The invention of the horse collar allowed them to use horses instead of slow-moving oxen for plowing. And the widespread adoption of the three-field system of crop rotation, where they'd plant one field in the spring, one in the fall, and leave one fallow, dramatically increased food production. More food meant more people. The population of Europe exploded, and this population growth fueled the rise of towns, the Crusades, and everything else we've talked about. Then look up. Look at a Gothic cathedral, like Notre Dame in Paris or Chartres. These were not the product of a dark age. They are miracles of engineering, physics, and art. Medieval architects, without the help of computers or modern equations, figured out how to use a combination of pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses to build structures with stone walls that seemed to dissolve into stained glass, flooding the interiors with a light that they saw as divine. They were the moonshots of their era, projects that took generations to complete, requiring the skills of thousands of masons, carpenters, and artists. And what about the life of the mind? It's true that most people were illiterate. But in the monasteries and the new universities that began to spring up in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford in the 11th and 12th centuries, a vibrant intellectual life was flourishing. Scholars were rediscovering the lost works of Aristotle through translations from Arabic. They were debating theology, philosophy, and natural science with a ferocious intensity. It was these medieval universities that laid the groundwork for the Western intellectual tradition, creating the very structures of learning that we still use today. The medieval period was not a pause in history. It was a period of profound transformation. It was messy, it was chaotic, and it was often violent, but it was also dynamic. It was the crucible in which the raw materials left behind by the Roman Empire were melted down and reforged into something new, the nations, the languages, the laws, and the ideas that would eventually become modern Europe. The darkness was real, but so were the sparks. And those sparks were slowly gathering into a flame that would light the way to the Renaissance. So, we've explored the medieval world from the inside out and the top down. We've seen the individual navigating their strange nights and their even stranger days, and we've seen the immense, powerful structures of society that boxed them in. We've walked the muddy fields with the serf, hustled through the crowded streets with the artisan, shivered in the siege camp with the knight, and knelt in the soaring cathedral under the watchful eye of a formidable church. It's a world that feels impossibly distant, a whole different planet of belief and behavior. But I think if you look closely, if you squint past the weirdness of the pointy shoes and the trial by ordeal, you start to see something familiar. You see the universal human drama playing out in a different costume. The struggle for power between the kings and the popes is not so different from the geopolitical chess matches of today. The guild master trying to protect his business from outsiders is the ancestor of every protectionist trade policy. The serf's dream of running away to the city to find freedom is the same dream that has pulled people to cities for millennia. The fear of the unknown, which they populated with demons and fairies, is the same fear that fuels our modern anxieties, even if we now give it different names. They were wrestling with the same fundamental problems we are. How do you create a just society? What is the right way to live? How do we find meaning in a world of suffering? How do we balance the needs of the individual with the needs of the community? Their answers were radically different from ours, shaped by a world without science, without secularism, and without a concept of individual rights. But the questions are timeless. Their world was a grand, and often brutal, experiment in how to organize humanity. And studying it, really trying to understand it on its own terms, isn't just about learning fun facts about the past. It's about understanding the deep, gnarled roots of our own world. The assumptions we live by, the institutions we trust, the very way we think, all of it grew out of the soil of this strange, dark, and brilliantly creative age. The medieval world is not dead and buried. It's the basement of our own house. And it's full of ghosts that are still whispering to us today. And that, I think, is a pretty good reason to keep listening.